Hello to everyone and greetings from the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights at the Palais des Nations in Geneva, Switzerland. We are here for a side event organized by co-organizers, the Permanent Mission of Uganda to the United Nations in New York, the Expert Mechanism on the Right to Development, and the United Nations University for Peace. My colleagues will put up on the screen where you can find more information on both the Expert Mechanism on the Right to Development and the University for Peace. But just to mention that the Expert Mechanism is a subsidiary body comprised of 5 independent experts appointed by the Human Rights Council for each region to advise the Council on how to operationalize the right to development. So we are here on the side event on a right to development approach to a renewed global financing framework, specific issues, climate and official development assistance, or ODA. It is in view of the 4th International Conference on Financing for Development, 3rd Preparatory Committee session, which is currently ongoing between February 10th and 14th, that is this week. Now, to say a few words on the concept of the event itself. This side event aims to discuss the Financing for Development for FfD4 Conference, aspects of climate finance, ODA, and the reform of the global financing framework from a right to development approach. We will discuss relevant themes addressed in the FfD4 Elements Paper and the Zero Draft of the FfD4 Outcome Document to identify which right to development principles can be integrated into the future of development and climate financing agendas to make them fairer, more effective, and accountable. More specifically, the side event will underline the importance of increasing climate finance in a way that is consistent with the principles of equity, common but differentiated responsibilities, and respective capabilities. Exchange views on actionable strategies that promote commitments to climate finance while ensuring that these strategies do not compromise socioeconomic development financing. We will also discuss the state's duty to cooperate to ensure an enabling environment for ODA, to respect national development policies, eliminate existing obstacles to development, to respect national development and ensure that no new obstacles are created. And identify entry points in the outcome document of FfD4 to address compliance of financing mechanisms with human rights obligations to, among others, prevent any unintended negative consequences of development and/or climate finance. There are several guiding questions. I will not go through all of them. The concept note is available. We have it on public. So one or two of them may be, can the FfD4 benefit from using the right to development principles? Can operationalizing the right to development catalyze development and catalyze development and climate finance efficacy? How can the right to development framework contribute to climate finance's consistency with the principles of equity, common but differentiated responsibilities, and respective capabilities? So we are looking at how a right to development lens can help enhance our financing for development, both in terms of climate finance and development finance. The 1986 Declaration on the Right to Development provided us already in 1986 a vision of development that is aimed at improving human well-being, as well as all human rights in their full universality and indivisibility: economic, social, cultural rights, civil and political rights. It brought together all three pillars of the United Nations Charter: peace and security, human rights, and development. It provided a new development model or paradigm that looks at improving or achieving justice and equity at the national as well as the international levels. And it provided us with a paradigm of development as well as development cooperation, which we are looking at particularly today, which helps countries and peoples, individuals and peoples in all countries to achieve a development which is completely aligned with human rights and aims at achieving human rights. I will stop there in this introduction and call on our first speaker. It's my pleasure to call on His Excellency, Mr. Mark Bischler, Permanent Representative of Luxembourg to the United Nations in Geneva. Mr. Bischler, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Shami. Can you hear me?
Yes, very well.
Yes, perfect, perfect. Thank you very much, Shami. A good day to everybody in all the time zones. Let me start by thanking the organizers, the Permanent Mission of Uganda to the United Nations in New York, the UN University for Peace, and the UN Expert Mechanism on the Right to Development for including me in today's side event. I have a slight problem here. Just a second. I will be back in a moment. Yes, here we go. It is my distinct pleasure to participate in the discussion today on the background of my 14 years of professional experience in international development cooperation from a national and also from a UN perspective, my 2 years as an ambassador at large for climate change with a focus on climate finance, and of my combined 8 years at Luxembourg's ambassador at large for human rights, and as Shami said, permanent representative in Geneva, including during our recent 3 years mandate on the Human Rights Council. I do not list these different functions to establish my credentials, but I would like to state that I feel really privileged to have had assignments that converge almost in an inescapable way on sustainable human development. And this strikes me as being relevant because the principles of the right to development emphasize, as Shami has said also, they emphasize beyond economic growth, development is also about holistic human development that encompasses economic, social, cultural, and political dimensions. And in doing so, it is likely to generate sustainability and equity. Today's side event is squarely rooted in the preparation process of the 4th International Conference on Financing for Development later this year in Sevilla. And we most certainly should address the questions of funding and financing in terms of climate finance, in terms of ODA, or in any other kind or form of monetary means. However, I think it is also useful to reflect once again on the nature of the goals that we want to achieve before focusing on the ways and means to pay for their implementation. In doing so, we might even be surprised to rediscover how close these goals and objectives are to one another, especially if you apply a human rights perspective to them. I will then gladly switch to aspects of sustainable finance. The Declaration on the Right to Development has been adopted in a GA resolution in 86, and first and foremost, it pleads for a right for individual persons and peoples to participate in, contribute to, and enjoy economic, social, cultural, and political development. It puts the human person at the center of the endeavor, and it puts the primary responsibility of creating the favorable conditions for an equitable development at the feet of the states. It's prompting the states to work individually and to cooperate collectively for their national populations and for beneficiaries beyond their jurisdictions. Short parenthesis at this stage, if I may. As a matter of fact, the discussion about whether the right to development is an individual right or collective one has always sort of stricken me as artificial. Indeed, what is the use of an individual right if it is not guaranteed by the collectivity? I think this is not unimportant when we discuss how to solve global challenges like abject poverty and climate change, the risk of pandemics and of unregulated digitalizations, challenges that are of concern to everybody around the globe. All of these topics, we agree on all of these topics that no single actor, state or non-state, public or private, powerful as they may be, would be able to take on alone. A common denominator or an overarching conceptual and maybe even rules-based construct that could show us the way would be helpful, wouldn't it? Well, I would like to make the point that the United Nations human rights system can provide such a superstructure if we, as responsible members of the international community, wanted to. Its norms and rules are universal, they are indivisible, they are inalienable, as if they were drafted to be the binding glue for effective multilateralism at the service of both peace and security on the one side and economic, social, and cultural development on the other side. After all, human rights are the third pillar of the UN activities. I'm well aware that this is not completely new, but I thought it was worthwhile to recall it at a time when multilateralism is under harsh attack, when we witness an uncanny pushback on human rights norms and standards, questioning the rights of women and girls or minority groups, and when democratic principles and the rule of law, in war as well as in peacetime, are ignored and shoved aside for the benefit of a few and in flagrant disregard for the greater good. Well, these gloomy observations trigger almost a nostalgic feeling for the years 2014 and 2015. Let me explain and switch at the same time to the part of my intervention on development and climate finance. Back in 2014, the World Bank and 8 other multilateral development banks published a powerful collective wake-up call. If the world was to finance the implementation of Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals and of the Paris Agreement to combat climate change, both documents to be adopted respectively in September and December of 2015, if this were to happen, we had better step up our game. And the challenge that was put in front of us was to switch, as they said, to switch from billions to trillions for development and climate finance. In the summer of 2015, the Addis Ababa Action Agenda echoed that call and stressed the need to align private financing and public funding flows with the soon-to-be adopted SDGs, including the one on climate change. The challenge remained, of course, to trigger additional funding for the fight against climate change on top of official development assistance, for the fight against poverty, and to avoid the temptation of what is called the double dipping. International obligations taken by industrialized nations in the 70s in terms of ODA stay valid and have to be topped up by new financial flows. Since 2016, such new financing streams started to converge. Impact financing, ESG financing, and responsible social investment and their likes may not yet be the biggest part of international finance operations, but they are among the fastest growing segments of the global investment universe. Under the impression of the irresponsible financing practices that have led to international financial crisis in 2008, and with a new sense of urgency, especially among younger generations of investors, for swifter actions against climate change, and with the understanding that effective help in case of a pandemic like COVID needs more funding. With all of these understandings, investing with both a reasonable financial return and a positive social or environmental impact became a viable option for many. Let me just quote one example from Luxembourg. The Luxembourg Green Exchange was launched in September 2016 to list climate finance and social bonds under strict criteria in order to avoid, for example, greenwashing. It started out with only 47 bonds and assets around $100 billion. Today, 9 years later, it is proudly featuring over 2,000 labeled bonds with some $1.2 trillion in assets under management for sustainable investment, and in doing so serves both climate-related programs and projects as well as SDGs initiatives. You will be able to hear more about the cooperation between the Luxembourg Green Exchange and UN Women on gender bonds, and this in a side event in New York. When pursuing this type of initiatives, the partners at work contribute to the overarching goal of respecting human rights, the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, for example, the right to education and health, the rights of women and girls, to name but a few. So when I'm asked to identify entry points in the draft outcome document for Financing for Development 4 to address compliance of financing mechanisms with human rights obligations, to prevent any unintended negative consequences of development and or climate finance, I confidently point in that direction. The understanding must be clear that in combating climate change and in struggling for the implementation of the SDGs, we are, of course, fighting the same fight against global challenges. To do so with the openly declared will to serve at the same time the respect of human rights adds a potent arrow to our quiver when it comes to target more and more private sector investors that are looking for opportunities to do well while doing good. In conclusion, dear friends, I would like to argue that political and financial investments in human rights and in the face of global challenges like climate change and poverty are an expression of enlightened self-interest while contributing, as a matter of fact, to the greater good. I thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Bischler. And on that last point of the enlightened self-interest and doing the global good at the same time. So many things that you pointed out to are today more important than ever. The continued relevance and significance of the Declaration on the Right to Development. And those of you who are in this side event probably know that we are also on a journey towards a covenant on the right to development. We have a draft covenant currently in New York after several years of drafting in Geneva. It is now submitted to New York, and we hope to see the covenant adopted, and then we can work even more strongly on implementing the right to development and its principles, which Ambassador, you also highlighted. You also brought in the examples, for example, the green exchange, right? That I think it is going forward so important to also for countries to share their good practices and best practices. So let me stop there. Thank you again, and go on to our next speaker, Miss Maholeen Shah. I hope I'm pronouncing properly, or excuse me if I'm not. Professor of International Law of the University for Peace. Ma'am, you have the floor. Thank you.
First of all, thank you all so much for having me here, for organizing this event. My name is indeed Marjolein Schaap. The talk that I wanted to have today was really taking as a point of departure the Paris Agreement and international human rights laws, giving that angle into our discussion of today. So as we all know, under the Paris Agreement, states have this collective goal to hold the temperature increase to well below 2 degrees Celsius compared with pre-industrial levels, and are pursuing efforts to limit increases to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Our 2024 NDC synthesis report showed that even if we combine all the current NDC plans, and if they're and if they are fully implemented, we would see emissions of 51.5 gigatons of CO2 equivalent in 2030, a level that is only 2.6% lower than 2019. Greenhouse gas pollutions at this level will guarantee a human and economic train wreck for every country, without any exception. Moreover, the 2024 UNEP emissions gap report shows that in the upcoming 2025 NDC round this year, states must collectively commit to cutting 42% of annual greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 and 57% by 2035, and back this up by rapid actions. Or this Paris Agreement goal of 1.5 degrees will be gone within a few years. In other words, we as the international community as a whole are off track in taking actions. As a result, we are in a crossroad more than ever. While science increasingly clarifies our urgent need to act, the clarity in the content and scope of legal provisions are actually also crystallizing, establishing more precise obligations. We have a significant international agreements like the Paris Agreement, other environmental agreements, UNCLOS, international human rights treaties. And the human rights litigations and strategic climate change litigations that are currently going on, they show that states actually must take action and do far more than they're doing now. All these developments underscore these necessities for countries that have historically contributed the most to greenhouse gas emissions to take the lead and acknowledge their respective historical role and take meaningful steps that support developing countries. Such support is essential. Developing countries are, in that extent, in dire need of the climate finance to enable them to take the needed measures and ensure sustainable growth. In this regard, I find the 2024 report on climate justice of this Special Rapporteur on the Right to Development also very useful in how it conceptualizes right to the climate justice and how we can use it as a point of departure also for reconceptualizing climate finance. He argues that climate justice should respond to the triple injustice of climate change. The most vulnerable to the negative impacts of climate change are those who bear little responsibility for causing it. These groups are limited in their resources and capacity to cope with the effects of climate change. And third, the costs of the green transition have more significant negative impact on such low-income and vulnerable groups. As he said, the more ambitious the world community is in terms of mitigation and adaptation, the less will be the loss and damage and the consequent for remediation for affected individuals and communities. and to realize we need the necessary climate finance, far, far more than what is currently provided. So what is the situation from a legal point of view now? So we have the developed states that are responsible under Article 9 of the Paris Agreement, for instance, to provide the financial resources necessary for developing states to fulfill their obligations on the agreement. In 2024, we had in the recent COP, the international community that agreed to this new quantified goal on climate finance of at least $300 billion per year by 2035. However, the projections so far are skeptical if this number will be met. Moreover, there has been, rightfully so, a huge pushback and frustration, primarily from developing states, who argue that this goal falls far short of what is needed. What are needed aren't billions. What are needed, as the ambassador also mentioned, are trillions. Regarding loss and damage, the Paris Agreement does not obligate states to provide funding for loss and damage. I argue, actually, that on the basis of human rights law, international environmental law, and particularly taking as point of departure the right to development, the duty to cooperate, the principle of equity, and of common but differentiated responsibilities, states that particularly have historically contributed the most to climate change have such an obligation to contribute financially to the loss and damage funds. Considering the current state of the environment and the mounting challenges we face, we must rethink our approach to climate finance. The reliance on loans should be reevaluated and ultimately curtailed in favor of solutions that are prioritizing sustainability and the resilience of affected communities globally. Numerous reports show that debt threats are detrimental to developing countries. This disparity extends to the funds channeled through major institutions like the World Bank or other international financial institutions, where available funding often constitutes loans rather than grants, perpetuating a cycle of debt that has a detrimental effect on the development of these countries, and it halts progress in tackling climate change. While securing adequate funding for all pillars of climate justice is an overarching goal, scrutinizing these pledged contributions and any conditions tied to them is just as critical. There is a substantial inequity in funding distribution, with too much emphasis also, for instance, placed on mitigation efforts at the expense of adaptation initiative, crucial for many vulnerable communities. Affected communities in recipient countries should play a key role in determining what type of adaptation or mitigation funding should be used. They should be properly included in decisions that affect their lives, instead of donor countries stipulating the type of projects, the partners, or other type of conditionalities. Climate finance should have the ultimate goal of sustainable development in these affected areas as its points of departure. The right to development framework in that regard provides a structured method to actually analyze and evaluate the donors' holistic contributions and recipient countries' needs, including examining, for instance, imposed conditions and actual financial contributions. The urgency of the climate crisis compels us to pursue these innovative financing models that uplift rather than trap vulnerable countries, recognizing that our collective future relies on a just and equitable response. This transformation in our financial system is essential to actually build resilience and to actually ensure that every nature can contribute to it and benefit from a sustainable climate resilient future. I look forward to hearing the other contribution and to discussing this topic further today.
Thank you so much, Ms. Kapp, for that very convincing and strong call for climate justice, for the countries to deliver on the obligations and commitments that go back to many different international legal instruments, the UNFCCC, the Paris Agreement, even in the sphere of human rights and sustainable development, as we all countries, all peoples aim to achieve this goal of sustainable development. And the right to development already in 1986 provided several important principles and elements such as justice and equity, such as the 3 levels of obligations. So states have obligations, of course, towards their own people and their primary responsibility towards their own people. But at another level, they have extraterritorial obligations, and at another level, they have international and collective obligations through international and regional partnerships and organizations. So thank you for reminding us that these are not just nice things to do, but are obligations and commitments that states have already committed to. Also, I'd like to remind of the Rio Declaration, Principle 3, Vienna Declaration, Principle 11, Article 11, which says the right to development must be fulfilled in order to equitably meet the developmental and the environmental needs of present and future generations. So even though in that sort of pre-era where, like today we talk about climate finance and much more than in 1992, given all that has the severe and urgent climate emergency or crisis that we are facing today. But already it spoke of the need to move towards this equity and justice for present as well as future generations. Thanks again, and let me move on to our next speaker, Mr. Bonnie Ibabo, member of the expert mechanism on the right to development. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you very much, Shemi, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me to this discussion, which is happening at an opportune time. So in my brief intervention today, I want to speak to 2 of the guiding questions in the concept note for this event. The first one is the question, how can the 4th International Conference on Financing for Development, FfD4, benefit from using right to development principles? So that's the first question I would like to address. The second one is, what actionable strategies can promote commitments to climate financing while ensuring innovative strategies do not compromise socioeconomic development financing? So the 2 focus here will be the benefits of right to development principles and also thinking through actionable steps. So on the first question of how right to development principles can benefit FfD4, I want to focus on 2 themes. The first is the principle of participation, inclusive participation. And the second one is the principle of international cooperation, the duty of states to cooperate to achieve development. Both principles very well enshrined in the Declaration on the Right to Development. On strategies, I will want to speak specifically to climate financing, which is related to a study I'm currently concluding for the expert mechanism on climate justice. So let us start with participation. We know that participation is a fundamental principle of the right to development. We know that active, free, meaningful involvement of individuals and communities in shaping their own economic, social, cultural, and economic lives is a key and foundational principles of the right to development. And even the zero draft of FfD4 acknowledges this, that participation is central to financing for development. The section, for instance, in the draft on foreign direct investment and private capital mobilization for sustainable development calls for all blended finance transactions to be aligned with national sustainable development projects, be transparent, and have clear accountability mechanism, including, and I'm quoting the draft document here, the participation of local communities in decisions affecting their community. So the draft document really emphasizes this. But although the zero draft makes occasional reference to participation here and there, in my view, it does not sufficiently articulate the centrality of participation of affected communities in decision-making relating to other critical aspects of financing for development agenda outlined in the draft, and I'll give some example here. So there is no discussion on participation in relation to taxes, to illicit financial flows, to debt, to global economic governance, and to technological advances for sustainable development. So yes, participation is referenced, but it is not seen as integral to the critical sectors of development financing that draft addresses. On international cooperation, we also know that international cooperation is central to the right to development. The duty bearers for the right to development are primarily states, but the Declaration on the Right to Development and the entire Right to Development agenda also emphasizes the duty of states to cooperate. The duty of states to cooperate to fulfill the right to development is anchored on the principles of shared responsibility, fair economic relations, knowledge sharing, and respect for sovereignty. Again, the FfD4 Zero Draft Outcome Document acknowledges this. It acknowledges that international cooperation must, and I'm quoting here again, play a fundamental role in achieving the 2030 agenda, complementing the efforts of countries to mobilize resources domestically, especially the poorest and vulnerable countries. The zero draft also correctly notes that, and again quoting, persistent poverty and inequality, climate-induced disasters, and crisis are all increasing demands for international development cooperation. The draft also calls for strengthening development cooperation architecture. So there is some reference in the discussion around financing for development leading up to FfD4 that international cooperation is central. The main limitation of the zero draft with reference to its call for international cooperation, however, is that it omits a fundamental impetus and justification for cooperation and collaboration, which is global inequities, global inequalities, historical responsibility for climate crisis, and the obligation of those most responsible for the crisis to do more to address it, a topic that we just heard about from my colleague who presented earlier. In fact, the word equity only appears once in the zero draft, which is a very long document. And the word justice does not appear at all. Several civil society participants noted this glaring omission of the FfD4 at the stakeholder town hall meeting on February 7th, a recent town hall meeting. And many of these stakeholders criticized the zero draft in this regard. They criticized its failure to address the root causes of climate and environmental crisis. I align myself with this critique of the zero draft. We cannot prescribe sustainable solutions to a problem without first excavating and examining the roots of that problem. So I believe that in the conversations around moving forward, international development financing or even climate financing has to be preceded with a discourse on climate justice. So in a few minutes I have left, let me turn to actionable strategies. What can be done? What are the low-hanging fruits that we can focus on to address some of these gaps? So we agree that there is a consensus on the point that climate financing plays a pivotal role in global efforts to mitigate and adapt to climate change. As the world faces increasing severe climate disasters, financial mechanisms designed to support sustainable development ambitions must be strengthened. But even as we call for the strengthening of these structures, what we are seeing and His Excellency the Ambassador made reference to this, is a gradual, I wouldn't even say gradual, a speedy rollback of some of the gains in climate action and climate financing. And I'll give you an example. In the past few months, almost all the banks, big North American banks in the United States and Canada, have pulled out of the Net Zero Banking Alliance. These departures have left many questions about the future of banking climate ambitions. While some financial institutions, mainly in Europe, still remain in the alliance, there are real questions now whether that alliance can be sustained. And just to remind our listeners, these Net Zero Banking Alliance is a group of leading banks that pledged sometime in 2021 to invest and lend and engage in marketing activities with net zero gas emissions as their goal. But yet we see all the big banks pulling out of this alliance. And we also see a rise in political leaders who are climate skeptics and climate deniers. And all of this means that we must redouble our efforts. We must continue to push for at least three things. The first is that states and the international community must do more to fulfill and expand financial commitments. We need to strengthen and honor, developed countries must honor their financial commitments and establish a transparent process to ensure accountability. Expand the role of public financial institutions in climate financing. There's been a very interesting debate that public banks can provide a new ecosystem for climate financing. It's an interesting work that is being done. And the suggestion is that there is enough fund among public banks, national public banks, that can be harnessed to complement financing from multilateral development banks to support climate financing. The final promising development and action item that I think we can continue to focus on is climate litigation. Drawing on both domestic and international law. And we're seeing more of this. Civil society organizations bringing cases before national courts, domestic courts, and international courts to demand climate justice and to enforce the climate obligations of not just companies, but also states. So in conclusion, I would say that we are at the crossroads. This is a critical moment, not just for climate financing, but development financing generally. And there's a need to reaffirm some of the foundational principles going back to the Paris Climate Agreement that have been the basis of climate financing. Addressing these limitations also includes centering climate justice, fulfilling financial commitments, increasing adaptation funding, simplifying access to resources, prioritizing grant-based finances, and strengthening private and public sector engagement. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ibavu, for that very full presentation, comprehensive, highlighting the duty to cooperate and participation. In the interest of time, I will move on immediately we will play the video message from Mr. Surya Deva, Special Rapporteur on the Right to Development.
I would like to thank the co-organizers of this side event for this timely conversation and also considering to invite me. In my intervention, I would like to highlight how and why the right to development, different aspects of it, different principles of it should inform the conversations, the outcome document about the international conference that is taking place in late June on financing for development. Let me start with the nature of the right to development. Now, right to development is both an individual and a collective right. And this has been articulated even by the expert mechanism in its paper. And I think that is where the financing for development outcome document has to reflect on these two dimensions of it. This is not either or, And this is not unique about right to development. Many other human rights have both individual and collective dimensions. And I think that is where we have to ensure that it is the development of each and every human being everywhere that is taken into account when we're talking about financing. A related aspect is that this is not merely an economic development issue. A right to development is a very holistic human right. And I think in addition to economic development, the political, social, and cultural dimensions of development cannot be ignored. Because if we have to provide a dignified life, a life where everyone can aspire to become anything, that is crucial that we approach this issue in a holistic manner. Now I would like to highlight the other aspects of right to development. And here I would like to suggest for your consideration that any financing for development should be for a particular model of development. Because if we finance for development that creates inequalities or that destroys the environment, that financing for development is not going to work. So I will suggest that the financing for development should be for inclusive, sustainable, and participatory development. Now, what makes development inclusive? And I think that is where the idea of leave no one behind becomes crucial. How the right to development can inform the conversation. And I would suggest here that the principle of intersectionality that I have highlighted in my report is very fundamental. Because different people have different needs and aspirations, and they are also impacted differently by the challenges that the world is facing. So those intersectional dimensions have to be considered in articulating this idea of development. Another principle of right to development is fair distribution. And I think that is where we can see the challenges that the world is facing in terms of the growing inequalities, especially the economic disparities. So can we impose obligations on the extremely rich people to contribute to financing for development? That is where taxing the super rich idea becomes crucial, because the current economic model is making certain people extremely rich. And that is where the responsibility, the duty have to be imposed on those as part of the alternative models of raising the finance for development. The second issue of development is it has to be sustainable. Now that is where again the principles of right to development can be relevant. Intergenerational equity is a core aspect of the right to development, and I think that has to be considered. We cannot develop in a way that compromises the environment or planetary boundaries. CBDR is another principle that is of relevance here. In the context of climate justice, climate finance, the question is which states have to contribute to the financing for development. And that has to be considered in the historical context in terms of which has caused the emissions more historically or continue to do that even in today's time. So these are the elements of right to development principle that should be contributing to sustainable development aspect of it. The third and the final issue is about the model has to be participatory. And if you recall, the 1986 declaration talks about that this is a right of people to participate in, contribute to, and enjoy the right to development. And this participation, which is active, free, and meaningful, is crucial. So people should be able to participate. But even the governments, developing countries, civil society organizations, they should be able to participate in these processes and negotiations to develop an outcome document. And I think that is where the reform of international financial architecture becomes crucial, because the participation is not on equal terms in these particular fora. We can of course link it with another vital principle of right to development, which is self-determination, because national priorities should be considered when we are talking about the right to development and the needs and aspirations of people of a particular country and the government of that particular country. So when the financing for development is taking place, in my view, we should keep in mind not only the nature of this right, but also that this financing is taking place for contributing to inclusive, sustainable, and participatory development. I very much hope that the side event will facilitate constructive conversations. Thank you very much once again for giving me the opportunity for this participation.
Thank you, Mr. Deva, for that contribution and highlighting many points where the right to development principles and framework could enhance the FfD4 outcome document and the FfD4 process as a whole. Next, I give the floor to Ms. Reyes. Ms. Emilia Reyes, Program Director of Policies and Budgets for Equality and Sustainable Development, Equidad de Janeiro. Thank you. You have the floor.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to join you all in this panel and in this discussion. I wanted to highlight that I'm speaking on behalf of the coordination mechanism of civil society engaged in the FfD process. So indeed, we are coordinating the working group on ecological and climate finance. And just wanted to highlight some of the elements that have been mentioned. FfD is a normative space, and therefore, it is very important that we don't think of it as a space in which we're getting more money out of it, more finance, but rather is how can we regulate the dynamics that are ruling underneath the economic and the financial architecture. And therefore, it is a great opportunity to not only think about how we can expand the finance that is much needed to address the ecological and climate crisis, but more importantly, how we can harmonize the global economic and financial architecture in alignment with the environmental entities and treaties that are attending the ecological agenda. So it is very important because we need to recognize that we are above overshooting 6 out of 9 planetary boundaries, and therefore the Earth system is in dire need of an economic system that is in harmony with it and not against it. And we know that as of now, the current economic system that is based on the premise of economic growth and that has some indicators such as GDP that are wrongfully measuring harmful economic activities, such as, for instance, militarism, the extraction and production of fossil fuels and gas, and even the harmful impact of sectors that are having negative environmental impacts, such as the larger textile industries, etc. So it is really important that we may take this opportunity in the FfD negotiations to really see the bigger picture of the current economic system and to try to find a system change that is very much aligned to promote the well-being of people and the planet. This is really important to think. And especially the right to development is a key point of entry because it also helps us to think that this is not only about finding financial support for the usual techno fixes, but rather how are we thinking also in the global dynamics that are happening now. And for instance, precisely, it is very important to find at the heart of the measures that we need to promote sovereignty, self-sufficiency, and autonomy for the global south. This is really important, for instance, in the discussion of the environmental integrity now that, for instance, there is an agenda of energy transition for global north countries that are the highest emitters in the world. They are responsible of 92% of excess carbon emission globally, but also they're also responsible of 70% of the resource and use of extraction, the extraction of the resources from the global south to the global north. Globally, they are responsible of the 70% of those the extraction of those resources. for soil consumption in the global north, and therefore this has an impact also in the ecosystem integrity, and therefore we cannot just assume that the global south is going to be the territory for extraction and for the disposal of waste. And the major agenda that has been discussed in FfD, such as, for instance, on the trade of raw minerals, is now being discussed as a potential for development. Whereas we know that if we don't change the current patterns of unequal exchange, then that would mean that there is going to be another trend of mega projects in the global south to again destroy the ecosystems of the global south for the sole use of the consumption in the global north. So this is a larger conversation that we need to have, and this is why the right to development is so important, with all of these principles such as CBDR, but also fair shares, and impacting very strongly on a larger definition of planning. Like if we are going to be doing an energy transition in a larger framework of a just and equitable transition, what is the global south transiting towards? And of course, we are thinking that there is a very important need to recognize that there are many needs of populations in the global south, and therefore all of the planning towards an energy transition need to happen towards delivering the needs of the population in the global south, and shifting our understanding of what are the terms of cooperation in an international framework. That's why, for instance, we are not thinking only on measures on how we can get more funding for climate finance or for ecological integrity, but rather how we are changing the global financial architecture. In that sense, civil society is asking for a convention on international cooperation in which we can start discussing within the UN system all of the terms of engagement amongst countries in the discussion, not only of ecological integrity, but also further on larger principles on international justice. But again, this is really important to recognize that that we also at the same time need to eliminate barriers that are related to other chapters on the FfD agenda, such as, for instance, to eliminate the clauses on investor-state dispute settlements that are so far posing many obstacles for developing countries. So far, we know that 75% of ISDS globally goes to developing countries, focused on their commitments on when developing countries want to uphold their environmental and climate commitments, then they are facing ISDS. And 92% of those lawsuits come from global north actors, mostly focused on fossil and gas industries. So that is a huge barrier that we need to tackle on, and that is one in the chapter of trade. But another is one, the credit rating agencies. We know the example of the Yasuni referendum in Ecuador, in which the people voluntarily decided that it was really important to leave the fossil fuels in the ground in a territory that is also upheld by indigenous peoples. And then 2 days later, the credit rating agencies ranked Ecuador in a lower scale, precisely in relation to investments. So the violation of credit rating agencies on environmental principles is very important. So we really want to tackle the regulation of credit rating agencies, and even proposing a credit rating agency that is situated in the UN to really tackle in a larger manner the financial architecture. So there are many proposals from civil society regarding to the bigger picture, and it is really important to emphasize that we are also upholding the primacy of public finance. We think that, as another human rights rapporteur on poverty in 2018 stated, how privatization is actually the factor that promotes the larger share of violations in the world. So it is really important that the UN listens to these expert voices, and therefore we are opposed to the financialization, market-based approaches, or blended instruments with private capital, or even debt-created instruments such as bonds, and these being presented as part of the solutions, because they are not. There's plenty of evidence of that. And also there is plenty evidence since 2015 that the private sector has not come up to the call of from billions to trillions, that they have not stepped up to the challenge on saving the humanity. So really, we need to make a very strong call for the primacy of public finance, the responsibility of developed countries in upholding their commitments, and even stepping up to their responsibilities, their ecological debts that they have to the global south. And we are there as civil society to stand side by side the UN system and member states who are willing to commit to the principles of ecological integrity and the well-being of the people. Finally, I just want to say that there is currently a very dangerous trend in the FfD negotiations to kick out civil society and observers from the room when the proper negotiations start. The modalities of participations are so blurred that they want to start negotiating next March without us being in the room. And we know that that not only generates opacity, but also that emphasizes the power dynamics that are happening in the room. We've known that, we've seen that, but also in the past, civil society towards ADES, we were part of the delegations, but we were also observing the negotiations until the final moments. FfD has always been very inclusive for the participation of civil society, so it is also our call here for member states to uphold their commitments to participation to democratic principles and let observers being in the room. It is only together that we make the UN stronger and the global agreement stronger. So it is our hope that the decision of opacity be reversed and that the UN continues to uphold their commitments to the people. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ms. Reyes, for that critical message from the critical voice of civil society, not only pointing at the need to base climate finance on common but differentiated responsibilities, respective capabilities, and all the principles that we know, the agendas, the 2030 agenda, the financing for development from Monterey to Doha to Addis Ababa and now to Seville. But also very importantly, that voice, that call for systemic change, for transformative change, whether it's regard to trade or investment or the debt. Thank you so much. And now, may I call upon, with pleasure, the representative of the United Nations, the Permanent Mission of the United Nations, to the United Nations, of Uganda, to say a few words before we open the floor for questions. The representative of the Permanent Mission of Uganda to the United Nations in New York. You have the floor.
Thank you, ma'am. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. It's a pleasure to be part of this side event, and on behalf of Uganda, we wish to thank the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights for convening this important side event at the sidelines of the third preparatory committee of the 4th International Conference on Financing for Development, titled A Right to Development Approach to a Renewed Global Financing Framework, Climate Change and ODA. The right to development is very important and should be realized as soon as possible. Uganda, as the chair of the NAM, or Non-Aligned Movement, will continue to spread efforts to realize the right to development. I have a short intervention, but I wanted to emphasize that as Uganda and chair of NAM, we are at the forehead of this, and we of the right to development, and we are part of the whole process. So thank you very much, and with my few words, I hand back over to you, Madam Coordinator. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Madam. And now we will open up the floor to questions. I think there are already some questions in the chat. No? So we invite you to raise your hands and make questions, comments, or suggestions, as this whole event has been geared towards contributing suggestions from a right to development approach or perspective or framework to the ongoing process of financing for development, in particular the outcome document and the elements paper and the process more generally. So we invite your questions, comments to any of the speakers. You can also raise your hands, either write in the chat or raise your hands. Ms. Sarah Galloway, please go ahead.
Hello and greetings. Thank you so much for this insightful session. This is Sarah Gawhari, originally from Afghanistan, based in Germany, and I'm the founder and CEO of VIRA, Women's Empowerment Research Association. I just wanted to add some suggestion. As a policy and research organizations or center, we really appreciate those who are working in this area. And we saw our collective action for the Pact of the Future. Unfortunately, we are as a UN volunteer partner with Youth Affairs. So from zero draft till now, we could see very progress on the Pact of the Future. Now it's time we must act for that. And in the FfD International Conference, also we need some collective action. It means that let's make a very transparent ecosystems in every country. It's very rare, especially on my country. We really need a transparency systems when the budgets are investing or on the projects. It would be so great to involve the local communities, the local actors. We should know where we wanted to invest this budget. That's very important. We must conceptualize the concepts of those projects. We must avoid the duplication of the projects because we need fundamental things in this planet nowadays. We saw many investment and many budgets are spent in Afghanistan. But as a citizen of Afghanistan, I appreciate everyone's international communities who work. But as a person who have been more than 16 years worked with different international NGOs, I couldn't see any fundamental effect on my country. It means that let's make change. Let's broad the opportunity for everyone, and the local actors should get involved. And from the bottom to the up level, everyone should be involved. The expertise, the researchers, we should always make a very systematic channel for these people. And thank you very much for your working. And I hope we could also achieve a very impactful result in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Is there anyone else who would like to make a comment or ask a question?
Sorry, I have a question, except I don't know how to raise my hand.
Okay, I think you can just go ahead. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I really much appreciate it. I found the speakers really the speech is really informative. I have one question regarding right of development for Indigenous and First Nation communities. I work with the First Nations and Indigenous communities in North America, Canada, and also Central America. And I wanted to know, when it comes to the right of development, how do we envision incorporating Indigenous people's rights within the development process? There are some specific rights, including communal rights, even you might even say cultural rights and even forms of sovereignty, not necessarily independence, but sovereignty, like cultural rights. How can we incorporate those rights into the right of development in the future?
Thank you. There's also some comments in the chat, which I think everybody has access to. Speaking of the youth perspective, for example. Let me now, in the interest of time, go back to the speakers.
Read the questions. You can read the questions. No? From the chat, yes.
There's one from Irfan Pulani. From a youth perspective, it is crucial that global financing frameworks prioritize not only climate resilience, but also youth-led initiatives. Young people are driving innovative solutions in climate adaptation, but access to finance remains a major barrier. How can international mechanisms like ODA better integrate youth-led climate action into funding strategies? And we have another question from Selina Derit. I would like to ask Mr. Bonnie Ibabo a question. I learned from the other sessions on agri-finance that there is a shift towards climate bonds, green and blue bonds offered by IFIs and other banks such as JPM, BNPP. You mentioned that major banks are pulling out of the Net Zero Alliance. Is it possible for you to elaborate more on this, why banks are pulling out, and the role of these climate bonds in climate finance?
Yeah. Can I take the last question first?
Absolutely.
Okay,
Thank you.
in the interest of time, I'll be brief. So why are banks pulling out? I'll tell you what the banks are saying. So let's go with what the banks are saying first, and I'll tell you what I think, which are two different things. So I'll tell you what Citibank says. Citibank is the latest big bank, American bank, to pull out of the Net Zero Alliance. And ironically, Citibank was one of those who initiated the alliance in 2021. Well, the official statement from Citibank was that the bank had, since 2021, when it was part of that initiative, now put in place processes and procedures to support its sustainability and net zero ambition within the framework of the banking operations, and that there was no longer a need to be part of this alliance. So that's official speaks. That's the official rhetoric. But if you ask me, I will say that the sudden decision of North American banks, and like I noted earlier, it's mostly North American banks, United States and Canadian banks. The alliance has about 135 banks committed to it. Many European banks are still committed to it. So I will say that the recent pullout in the 1 month or so of North American banks is not unconnected to the political climate. We have political leadership, particularly in the United States, that is not as committed to climate action. In fact, some would argue that there is a thread of climate denialism running through the current administration. That's not something that is a secret. And I think the private sector and the corporate sector is taking a cue from the political winds that are currently blowing. So whether this will spread to other parts of the world, to Europe, to other parts of the world, to Asia, remains to be seen. But that's my own explanation, and it goes back to the point I made earlier, that now is the time to really, really dig in and reaffirm the commitment to climate financing. Quickly to the question on indigenous people's rights, I think the right to development really does address this in two ways. The first one, you talked about collective cultural rights. the right to development reaffirms both individual and collective rights. And in fact, my mechanism just produced a comprehensive study on the individual and collective dimensions of the right to development, which are integral to the right to development. So while it provides for individual rights, it also provides for collective rights. And it sees this not as opposing or in tension, but complementary to the full actualization of human rights. The other aspect of the right to development that is relevant to indigenous rights is self-determination. Self-determination is a core pillar of the right to development. And in many indigenous communities, this is very important, that they have the ability to control their resources, to control their political and economic destiny within the framework of development. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I would now like to call on Mr. Bichler to either answer to some questions or comments or make your final remarks. And all the speakers now have 2 minutes to say their fine closing remarks.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator. It's been really a fantastic discussion. I think it's very from very different perspectives and pointing to a certain extent to the same problems, obviously, but then also finding common ground on some of the opportunities that will come up at FfD4. I mean, the challenges are enormous. The scope to be covered, both on the side or on the 3 sides, I should say, of SSD implementation, an effective fight against climate change, and then also ensuring the respect of human rights and especially the right to development. It's an extremely large scope, and not many people are so familiar with the overlaps that obviously come up between these aspects. Then, of course, the quantitative and the financial side of it. Well, several of us pointed to the need of raising much more financing and funding. When I say financing, I more or less speak about the private sector funding that would come more from the public sector side. I heard Ms. Reyes calling rather for the public side. Of course, we know that the fiscal space of many governments, and all governments should chip in, obviously. Many governments have a fiscal space that we're not allowed to step up their efforts. Unfortunately, there are some who still can do, but in either way, the amounts of monies needed combined by far surpasses the sum of all national budgets available. So finances being more or less binary, it's either public or private, or maybe it can be, of course, it can be mixed, which is an opportunity. But the public financing alone will simply not do the trick. The demands and the necessary fundings are, the amounts are too high to be covered by national budgets alone. So reaching out to a private sector, to a part of the private sector that has followed these topics more intensely, ever more intensely over the past decade, is, I think, a worthwhile endeavor. And why should we exclude these opportunities when we are under such a pressure, and when public financing is in rare availability these days, especially when very large traditional donor countries are pulling out their financing of programs and projects targeted at overcoming global challenges, be it pandemics or others like climate change and poverty, as a matter of fact. No, all of this, thanks, is to say thank you very much again for including me, and we will stay, of course, very much implicated in the upfront to the FfD4 in Sevilla. We will keep a keen eye on the aspect of right to development in that aspect, as we did over the past 3 years when we were members in the Human Rights Council. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Sincere thanks, Ambassador Bischle. We are very privileged to have you today in this discussion. I would like to also just pose include one other question which was in the chat, which we missed out. Emin Aslanov, our colleague from OHCHR, would like to ask panelists to elaborate on the focus of the draft outcome document on least developed countries and small island developing states. If there is time, I will move on to the next speaker for just a couple of minutes closing remarks or answers to any questions that haven't been answered. Ms. Sharp.
Thank you for giving me the floor again. I think in my closing arguments, what I would want to talk about is I want to take as point of departure the concept of accountability. And the way I want to talk about is that I think it's twofold. It's one is that I think we need to make sure that we really walk the walk of that we're arguing that we should be doing. And in that regard is also precisely in policy documents, in negotiations that are happening, and any type of normative processes that we really ensure is indeed the right to information, transparency, equity, climate justice in that regard. Are they all really front and center to it? So are we really ensuring that, for instance, in our participatory processes, it's not a matter of just having a seat at the table, but you're actually being heard and it's actually being taken into account there? And then I think there are differences in the various forums where we know that some forums like this one are far more inclusive than other forums are. So I think that's something that we should keep in mind there. And I saw a second aspect of accountability that I would want to focus on is precisely in relation to the climate finance itself. I've seen various panelists mention very interesting contributions on it in really critically analyzing and mapping like what's happening here. You know, are there any adverse effects on human rights that we might not actually see in terms of great intention, poor outcome in that regard? Who is really included? How do we actually ensure that indeed the local populations are properly included in this entire process? And that, for instance, if adaptation is necessary, that there's not a focus, well, we can only get money on this aspect or those aspects there as well. So I would say, like, I think a huge part of that is also that further mapping and critically analyzing there what is happening. And in that regard, me being the lawyer, precisely also further encouraging that route to the court of really highlighting all the moments where we feel that actually things went wrong there. For instance, in the context of extractive industries, or also in how indigenous peoples have been being affected or being harassed in that context by big corporations. And I think that accountability angle would also further enable us to really realize and ensure that the sustainable development is happening, that climate finance comes there where it's actually needed, and it actually makes a positive contribution that we wanted to have. Thank you so much for today for having me.
Thank you very much. And finally, Ms. Reyes.
Thank you so much for giving me the floor again. Just wanted to highlight on certain issues on climate finance. Of course, it is really important that the framing that has been set by the UNFCCC with all of the system of funds that keep on being strengthened, and especially to allocate funding for adaptation and the loss and damage fund. And this is really important to stay away from the current mission creep of the World Bank and the IMF into the climate finance. This is why, because this international financial architecture operate on the basis of debt and loans, and also impose austerity measures worldwide. They use different terms, but we know that in the end, these austerity measures are impacting negatively in the social expense, the public expense, and even the possibility to do the climate action. So they exchange it for other false solutions such as debt swaps that are actually very minor, very small, they take forever, they don't really help to solve not even the debt crisis or the climate crisis. So all of these tools that have been posed by these larger institutions are actually worsening the situation. So it is really important that we focus back on the public and the larger multinational efforts. And this is where I come back. Thank you so much for the Ambassador Bickler when he was mentioning the reduction of the fiscal space. And this is why the tax and the debt dimension are so important, not at the national level, but the global situation that we're looking at, for instance, with illicit financial flows. And we really need to tackle corporate tax abuses, tax havens, and all of the issues of the depletion of funds that is coming from the global south to the global north, and that are not only reducing the fiscal base, but actually undermining the fiscal capacity of sovereign decisions in relation to all of these dire topics that we're talking about, and also the debt crisis. This is why the civil society is calling for a sovereign debt convention in the UN, in following up in the conversation that is happening already in the tax convention in the UN. But there are other conversations that need to happen simultaneously, such as the situation of technology, for instance, in regards not only to challenge the techno fixes such as geoengineering and all of those false solutions that are also dangerous distractions, as opposed to really tackling the economic system that is harming the environment, but also dealing with the WTO and many of this conversation on intellectual property rights, precisely to have access to clean technologies, but also sovereign technologies. And many of these happen in conversations alongside indigenous people's rights and local communities' knowledges and technologies that we know that exist in the global south and that are real solutions as well at the territorial level. So there are many elements that can be discussed in the FfD. Each chapter, as you know, is related to in a rich manner, so to find the solutions. And it has to happen not at the national level, not at the regional level. It has to happen in the multilateral space, because all of these are global challenges. So very much welcome this collective invitation to think about FfD and how we can all find solutions together. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that powerful message, Ms. Reyes. And would Bonnie, would you like to say a final word or two in maybe half a minute to 1 minute maximum?
Yeah, just to briefly respond to the point that's been raised about how the zero draft addresses least developed countries and low-income countries. I would say there isn't much kind of engagement and appreciation of the unique position of seeds and low-income developing countries. There is some reference, some passing reference to the unique conditions, climate conditions, financing conditions in these countries in the section on foreign investment, sustainable foreign investment. But apart from that, I don't see the kind of robust engagement with the unique conditions, climate conditions, financing conditions that many of these countries face, that have been articulated elsewhere in many other UN documents, in many other forums. I think an opportunity was missed in this draft, and I know it's work in progress. Hopefully there's room to re-engage with that, to really emphasize and address some of the unique challenges of this state in a normative document like this.
Thank you so much, Bonnie. And we are exactly at the time that we are supposed to end this side event. I just want to say thank you to all the speakers and everyone who participated. And let's keep the conversation going, because there is much that can still be done. Especially, I'm reminded of the message of the importance to scale up the multilateral system and bring all of these development finance, climate finance, that ultimately we are looking towards the same goal in the end, to improve human life, to improve human rights for all people, all individuals, peoples in all countries. Let me end there by just reminding that there is a feedback form that is being shared. Please give us your valuable feedback. Thank you, and we'll see you again.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation. Have a nice day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank